Excellent. Hello, everybody. We're just gonna wait a few seconds for perhaps a few more people to join the room. All right, let's get started. So hello, everyone. I'm Mary. I'm the communications coordinator and the awards administrator for the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals. I am also one of the graduate student reps along with Sophie and Matthew. So today's session is on the topic of preparing a strong application for research grants, like the Curran Fellowships offered by RSVP. The Curran Fellowships are a set of travel and research grants intended to aid scholars studying 19th century British magazines and newspapers in making use of primary print and archival sources. These fellowships are made possible through the generosity of the late Aline Curran, Professor Emerita of English, Colby College, and inspired by her pioneering research on Victorian periodicals. The fellowships are awarded annually. RSVP intends to grant at least 6 Curran Fellowships each calendar year. Applicants may request up to $6,000 in their applications. The Curran Fellowship Committee may choose to grant partial funding, and these awards are paid out in US dollars. Well, the focus of today's presentation is predominantly on the Curran Fellowships. Much of what is going to be covered today could absolutely be extracted and applied to other grant proposals, so keep that in mind. I'm now going to introduce our presenter, Russell. Russell Wyland received his PhD from the Catholic University of America in 19th century British literature. He received RSVP's 2000 Van Arsdale Award for the Attic Society's Oxford Review, Idealism, Failure, and Early 19th Century Periodical Culture at the University of Oxford. And his research on Victorian periodicals has received funding from the American Philosophical Society and the English-Speaking Union of the United States. For RSVP, he has served as an evaluator in all 3 grant programs, Curran Fellowships 4 times, so obviously he has a lot of insight to offer here, and the Peterson Fellowship and the Field Development Grants 1 time each. Importantly for today's session, Russ is the Deputy Director of the Research at the National Endowment for the Humanities, the largest public funder of humanities research in the US. Before I hand over the mic to our speaker, I would like to remind everyone that this workshop is part of a series put on by the Digital Events Committee, who organizes regular events related to periodical studies. The next event coming up is called the Curran Index, Attribution in the Work of Historical Recovery and Periodicals Research. And this will be hosted on October 27th at 4 p.m. GMT. And if you need to register for that, check your newsletter, which just went out yesterday. The event will feature Dr. Lars Atkin and Dr. Emily Bell, the co-editors of the Curran Index. And these digital events offer insight into new directions in periodical studies. And we are so grateful to the committee members for all their hard work in organizing these fabulous workshops. And I just want to recognize the members of the Digital Events Committee. And this would be Prithi Joshi, Kari Newman, Katie Birch, Surav Chatterjee, Ali Hapchi, and Matt Poland. And a massive thank you also to our President Fanula for their help in executing today's event. So that being said, I'm going to invite Russ to take the mic.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary. And hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here. We are going to spend about a half an hour talking about the Curran Fellowship and talking about some strategies for writing a competitive research application. And then we're going to leave plenty of time for question and answer. These things don't happen unless a lot of people are working behind the scenes. So I do want to thank Fanula and the board and Kari and the beautifully named Mary Grant, most appropriate, for all of their help and organization. I'm really very, very appreciative. I have a lot of experience with grants, both getting them and evaluating them and so giving them away. However, I want to tell all of you at the outset that Every grant application is different, and there's no such thing as a perfect grant application. Every time you sit down to write an application for your project, it will change. It will be different. There's not a set formula for a grant application. There are things you need to do, but every one is a different kind of balancing act. And so what we're going to hopefully help you do is find and make sure you have all of those pieces that you need to create the best balance that you can in your application. So remember, no such thing as a perfect application. So if you think you can't write a perfect application, that's fine. You don't need to. And finally, and I'll say this a couple of times, if you don't apply, you won't be funded. That's the sure way to not be funded, is not apply. So, you know, hopefully this will inspire you to take that first step and apply. Did everyone see that slide change?
Yes, we did.
Great. We were having a little technical difficulty beforehand. So I'm glad everyone sees. So today's agenda, I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking about the Curran and what you need to do, sort of the nuts and bolts of the program. And then we're going to switch and talk a little bit about putting together that application. We are going to have time for Q&A, but don't hesitate to throw things into the chat. Mary has promised she will interrupt me if there's something that I should stop and address during the presentation. That's fine with me. Or if you're allowed to turn on your mics and just pipe up, please do. If you ask a question, and I know we're going to get to the answer later, I might put you off just slightly until we get there, but I promise we'll answer all of your questions. Also, if there are people out there, and this is a crazy thing about doing this by video, I can't see who's out in the audience. If there are people out there who have served on a Curran committee or have held a Curran Award, have done this successfully, and you have suggestions, absolutely pipe up. I'm perfectly open to that. So let's do a little Curran 101. The deadline is November 15th, and that is a hard deadline. No exceptions. If you've submitted on the 16th, even 10 seconds late, you are not going to be allowed in. The way you start is by going to the RSVPDigEv website. I'm not going to walk you through it step by step. You're all smart people. I don't need to show you how to work on the web and submit the application. But I am going to point out a few things. The first thing you're going to see are the application guidelines. And the first paragraph you're going to see in those guidelines, I think, is particularly important. Curran Fellowships are research and travel awards intended to support the use of primary sources from for the exploration of any aspect of the British periodical press in any of its manifold forms that may range from within Britain itself to the many countries within and outside the empire where British magazines and newspapers circulated during the long 19th century. I underlined 3 things there. It's research and travel awards. So if you're thinking you need money to write your project, to work, that you've already done the research, Curran Fellowships aren't for you. This is to encourage people who need to get into the libraries and to the archives to do research, and they need time to travel, usually for that. It's also for people who want to use primary sources. So if you're thinking that you would love to read Joanne Shattuck's recent book and something that Fionnuala has written, that's great. But we want you to be using primary sources. So you're getting in, you're looking at periodicals, you are looking at material that help us better understand the periodical press in the 19th century. And what is that 19th century? It's the long 19th century. So if your project is a little bit early and perhaps is into the Regency or is a little bit later and flirts with modernism, that's fine. We're looking at the long 19th century. You're still eligible. Your start date must be in 2024 for this award. So if you are thinking you want to hold this beginning in January of 2025, you're a little bit late, but if you move it back a month, you can do it. So 2024. You don't need to be a member. We want you to be a member. Please come and join us. We're a nice group of people. But you don't have to be a member to apply. And that's not taken, and your membership is not taken into account when we evaluate. What does an application include? You need to prepare some things. We provide fields that you will fill out that will give us some basic information about you and your project. We will ask you as well to attach a 2-page CV, or I should say a CV not to exceed 2 pages, a narrative not to exceed 3 single-spaced pages, 1-page description of the printed and manuscript materials you hope to explore with your award, and the name and email addresses of one recommender, an address of one recommender. Your project must be submitted, can be submitted really in 3 formats. You can attach them as PDFs, as Word documents, or as RTF documents. Okay. So it's really hard. I think one of the hardest things for me to learn when I was just starting to apply for grants was to put all of my good ideas down on paper and then send them away. And I had no idea about how they would be evaluated. The guidelines go through each of the pieces that you need to prepare in great detail. So go read those guidelines, make sure you understand them. Like I said, in my day job, I work in a granting organization. Our biggest problem still is that people don't read the guidelines. And so they make really silly errors because they simply didn't read the guidelines. So read the guidelines. When you do, you will discover, we tell you exactly how your application is going to be evaluated. And it's evaluated on 4 criteria. When we get in a meeting and we look at your application, we stick religiously to these 4 criteria. We do not deviate. We don't care about your membership. We don't care about your need. We look at these 4 criteria and try to evaluate only to these. So the importance of the project, including its use of materials relevant to a deeper understanding of the British periodical press in the 19th century. We'll talk about that. The quality of the application, including its clarity of expression. So it's the quality of what you put together and submit. The applicant's preparation to pursue the project. So it's about you too. The feasibility of the plan of work and the likelihood that you will bring the entire project to a successful completion in due course. In due course is important. You don't need to finish your whole project during the course of a Curran Fellowship. So what are those 4 criteria that I just read out? You can boil them down. And I would almost guarantee, in fact, I think I will guarantee that any fellowship program that you apply to ever are going to ask for these, essentially, it's 4 criteria here, but they're 5 things. It's the project, it's the proposal, it's the person, it's the plan, and the payoff. The 5 Ps. These are the 5 things that any project you undertake and you think you're going to need money for, these are the 5 Ps that you should be thinking of. Project, proposal, person, plan, and payoff. Ingrain those in your mind so that you're always thinking about them. Let's talk about them. And now we're going to shift to how to put together that that competitive application. So at the top of this slide, I've put, again, that criterion on the importance, and I've highlighted the importance of the project. It's the first evaluation criteria for a reason. It's the first among equals. You can have a beautifully put together application. You could have written beautiful prose, but if the project's not worth doing, if it's not important, then it's really not going, we don't really need to know any more than that. So this is really first among equals. So it's always about the project here. If the project's not worth doing, nothing else matters. So RSVP has chosen to frame it in terms of its importance. Other organizations might call it the significance. You might hear evaluators talk about the so what question. That's all part of this same thing. So when I want you, in my perfect world, what I would do is carve out a little time for each of you to sit quietly with a piece of paper and ask yourself, why is my project important? And that's going to serve as, in some ways, the basis for your request for money. Okay, so let's look what's going on in your mind when you're sitting there in the quiet. You have your steaming cup of coffee next to you, perhaps, and a cat on your lap, and you're asking yourself, why is my project important? There's some places you can go to help you answer that, and everyone will have a different answer. So you can go to the materials that you're using. Are they new? Are they unusual? Have others used them, but you're using them differently? Are you using them and looking at them from a different perspective than others have? So think about your materials. That's particularly important, I think, for the Curran, where we put such a premium on the materials that you're looking at. What are the questions that you're asking about the British periodical press? What is that thing that you're answering? So if you have a project and you're working on Thackeray, and all you want to do is look at things that he contributed to a periodical press, that's going to be a hard sell, because what you're really looking at is to answer questions about Thackeray. So the question is, what questions are you asking about the periodical press? Articulate those. So important for the Curran. How does your project relate to scholarly discussions? Okay, so now you're starting to think bigger. Think of this as concentric circles. You started in the middle with with your materials and why they're important, and then you're looking slightly larger about what questions are you asking about the periodical press. Now imagine what are those questions you're asking about the periodical press? How are those going to contribute, perhaps, to the scholarly discussion that's happening perhaps in RSVP, or among, I guess, what you would consider sort of your peers in your area. So what is your intervention, or what's going to get people talking about your work? Then go a little bit farther out. Will this address some larger discussions beyond the periodical study? So think Victorian studies. Are there discussions happening in the Victorian studies that your work might contribute to? That's another way of thinking about your importance. Finally, think about your methodology. The questions you're bringing, how you're going to realize your goal. How are you using the material? These are all parts of methodology, and you might be doing something different that other people have not done, or applying a methodology that no one else has done before, bringing a theory perhaps and applying it in a way that's interesting or new. All of you won't have answers for all of these things. and you don't have to. These are things that I'm hoping trigger your thinking about importance. What I want you to do is think, and then I want to you take all of those things and think about the research questions you're taking into the library or the archive that when you're on your award, all of those things about you've just identified about what makes your project important, how do those then feed into the questions you take into the library or the archive? My general rule of thumb here, usually I would say people who are successful when they apply are able to articulate 3 distinct, although often very closely related, ways that their project is important. Don't make the Curran evaluators hunt for your importance. And this is a real big change that I think all grantors are noticing now. When I get in a meeting with other evaluators and we're looking at an application, people are hitting, because they can, the search button. They're saying, oh, I need to find the importance of this application. And they type in importance. So if Curran calls it importance, it is to your advantage to say at some point, here is the importance of my project, and go through those things that appeared on that list you made when it was nice and quiet, okay? So mimic back to RSVP or to whatever agency you're applying to, the wording that they use. Never assume that your project is important, even if you're working on a really well-known and important set of material. The importance of your project is really should never be assumed. You have to write a good proposal, and that's so much more than good copy editing, but it's copy editing too. I want you to find not a friend to read your application when it's drafted. A friend will be nice to you. Someone who's not a friend will not be nice to you, and you want that person. Someone who's going to be very critical, and maybe someone outside your area, so that they can ask you questions about what you're doing, places that they didn't understand. I want you in your proposal to tell us upfront what you're doing. A lot of times reviewers will have to read for 2, maybe even 3 pages, and we're not sure what we're reading about. Are we reading about a dissertation? Is this a dissertation chapter you're doing research on? Are you hoping that this results in an article somewhere? So tell us what you're going to do in the first few lines. Know your audience. These are all basic things. You've heard these. You've probably taught these if you're in communication and rhetoric. You know your audience. Remember, people who are going to read this, they will definitely appreciate Victorian periodicals, but they might not know the time period or the particular periodical that you're working with. So you're going to have to remember to not to talk to more than just very narrow specialists. If you're heavy on theory, or you have a really technical application, remember a well-chosen example is a great way to let the evaluators into what you're doing. And so make sure you don't, a lot of times examples are the first thing we cut out when we need more space in an application. And I'm telling you, sometimes examples are, a well-chosen example is what will actually get you from being just a mediocre application to a competitive application. Avoid spin. Please avoid spin. People often think that they need to show that they're farther along than they really are, for example. and they'll write an application that makes their project look like they're farther along. But I'm telling you, evaluators are smart, and they will, an application like that frequently won't fit together. And they will pick and pick and pick at that application to figure out what's wrong. And all 99 times out of 100, it's that an applicant has wanted the application to see farther along. Yeah. So if you if you're just going into the archive and you're going into the archive to do your research, you can't probably provide how the book will be organized because you haven't done your research yet. Those are the kinds of things we see all the time. People want to make their project sound like something that it's not. Don't do it. It would avoid spinning your application. Think about how the application components fit together. When a panelist or a reviewer looks at your application, they're going to read it as one thing. Doesn't matter that it comes as a it doesn't matter that it comes as a narrative, as a CV, and you might put all of those things together separately. But remember, they read it as one thing. It's your request. So it makes sense for you to think about how all of those pieces work together. So, for example, if you have, if your resume shows that you presented a paper at the recent RSVP conference, and you're applying to push beyond that, but it's based on that, make sure that that's in your narrative, because they might or might not figure that out from your resume. If your project requires certain skills, and you say, well, that's on page 2 of my resume at the very bottom. But if that's crucial to doing your work, if you need to speak some Portuguese, for example, make sure that you mention that you have that skill. So start a dialogue between your resume and your narrative for things that really matter. Okay. People say, well, and this is just a kind of a quirky thing, people hate letters of recommendation. And I have to say, I've asked for them and I hate asking for them. But your letter writers can work for you too. You're going to provide them your application. You're going to provide them the evaluation criteria. But you can also give them some suggestions. I need you to focus on how this will contribute to feminist criticism. Or I need you to talk about the importance of these materials. Of course, you're going to do that in your application, but make sure that they know what they need to write about. And I think the best applications have all of their parts talking to each other. Okay. So the person, and I mentioned this before, your curriculum vitae does not speak for itself. One of the weird things in the humanities is that we like to hide, this is very kind of biblical, but hide our light under a bushel. Don't do that. If you have an accomplishment, make sure that that is front and center. Don't be afraid to brag a little bit. That's part of the grant getting game. So, for example, if you won another grant for this, if you've gotten money from your institution to go and do some work, that tells the panelists that another group of people had confidence in you. And it's a lot easier for me to be confident in you if I know others have. So look for those things, your strengths, and make sure that those are on full display in your application, because that's about you. I mentioned some of the other things, and the importance of having your letter writers address things. And I mentioned sort of intellectual, your ideas, but letter writers can also talk about you. If there are things that you think panelists need to know about you and your skills that maybe aren't clear, certainly have your letter writer do that for you. Come up with a plan, make sure it's detailed. So for Curran, you're going to be going into an archive. What are you going to be looking at? Do you know how much material is there? And so if you tell us, I'm going to stay there for 2 weeks, but then someone on the committee knows that there are 1,000 issues of a periodical there, and you haven't specified what you're going to look at. So make sure you give details. Let's see. Your plan must be reflected in the rest of the proposal. A lot of times people will write their plan separately, and then they will forget to look at the what they've said in the application. And then the plan doesn't actually match up with what they've told us. So that's a problem too. So read them and make sure that the plan makes sense given what you've told us and how you've described your project in the proposal. Or on the side, I would say, of being too ambitious rather than not ambitious enough. I would much rather sort of pull you back. Your plan is also probably contingent on how much money you get. And one of the nice things about Curran is we do try to really maximize the bang for the buck. So if we know that we don't have $3,000 to give, but we do have $2,500 to give, we'll look and we'll say, okay, could we give this project $2,500 and do something useful with it? And so, you don't have to come up with a budget per se, but you do have to come up with a budget amount. And one of the things that the Curran committee might do is trim it back slightly. But we really want you to do that work. And so we're not going to cut it back too much. Finally, the payoff, and this is pretty simple. The panelists have to have confidence that you are going to complete the project you've set out to start to do. Remember to tell us what that final product is. It's amazing how many applicants simply don't tell us what is the final payoff here. It's a book, it's a dissertation, it's an article. But there might be other sort of non-tangible payoffs in your classroom, for example. So there might be other things that aren't necessarily research-ish, but they're still important payoffs. Remember to tell us if you're just going to do research at this point, and we're going to fund you for your research, how do you get to your final product once the research is done? Do you think it's going to take 2 years with your full teaching responsibilities? What is, give us a sense of that timing. Okay. Now we're coming to the end of the presentation. Just a few 10 tips for you. Remember, the focus of your work has to bring us to a better understanding of the Victorian periodical press. That's the first tip. Allow yourself time to prepare. When you do, you will come up with a better application, and panelists will understand how all the pieces of the application fit together. The fourth, avoid jargon and technical language. If you have to use it, remember a good example. Play to your strengths. Play to your strengths. And don't forget to explain your strengths. Do you have previous work, previous research time, etc.? All of those things can be a strength. Do the work to build a realistic plan. That means do some research, find out if you haven't been to the archive before, write them a note, ask them how much material is available there. Think realistically about how much time it's going to take you. Come up with a realistic budget. Don't try to be too frugal, but at the same time, make sure you have enough, but at the same time, don't over request just because you can. Build a work plan. Remember to say how your project comes to an ultimate completion. Here's a really important one. If you aren't successful, try again. I don't know what the funding rate for Curran is. It used to be about 1 in 6 or so. So that means 5 out of 6 people will not be funded. That's a lot. You're in the majority. But if you want to get to that 1 in 6 that does get funded, you will have to try again. There are things to be learned from every time you submit an application. Think about this as a habit. You're going to try to develop a grant habit. So it's not just a one and done thing. And finally, and I come back to this, I said this right at the beginning, 100% of the people who don't apply don't get funded. Don't be one of those people. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You think, I can't write a perfect application, and therefore I'm not going to apply. Don't do it. Apply, because if you don't apply, that's the guarantee that you won't be funded. Okay, so it is now 11:40. That's about 30 minutes worth of information I've thrown at you. I think we're going to go to questions and answers here. I have some things in my mind. I have lots more to say on these matters. I'm giving you my email address, my Gmail address. I don't know, Mary. Will they have access to my slides if they want them? I'm happy to send them if they want them.
That's a great idea. If anyone's interested, you can email me or Russ and we'll make sure that you get a copy. But also, just so everyone knows, the presentation today was recorded in case anyone wants to go back and hear your commentary alongside the fabulous slides you prepared.
Yeah, so or you just have questions, later on, you're sound asleep a week from now and suddenly you wake up and think, oh my gosh, I'd never thought about this. Throw me an email. Happy to answer and help you along. I won't read a draft application, but I will answer your questions.
Amazing. Okay. That was such a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much for taking us through the current applications and best practices. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm the awards administrator. So I especially liked your rule of 3. Find 3 unique ways to describe the importance of your research. That's such a great practice for us to all think about. I'm going to open it up. Does anyone have any questions for Russ? If not, I actually have one. So at the end of your presentation, you talked about reapplication, which I think is so important with grants, especially humanities grants. Let's say I've applied for a Curran Fellowship before, but it wasn't accepted. What advice would you offer to someone to rework their application for this award cycle?
That's a great question. One of the one of the really, keep getting this error message all of a sudden. Am I still on?
You're still
You're
on.
just back, Russ. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna, yeah, that's weird. All right, so the advice I would give you is this. It's been probably a year since you last picked up that application. Look at your last application and try to read it with fresh eyes. Think about it in terms of the evaluation criteria and where you might have stumbled. Give it to someone else to read as well. You have a couple of things going for you. One, you already have your draft application done. You also have probably worked for another year. So you are going to have on your project. So you are going to have to rework it slightly. But hopefully in that year, it's helped you better understand the importance of what you're doing. And at the end of the day, that's the important thing, is figuring out why your project is important. And so that extra year of work that's happened on your project is probably going to give you some new perspective. So go through that whole process that I described again. Sit down someplace quietly and just simply ask yourself, why is this important? And you probably will come up with a slightly different answer. It's one of the things that we debate in the grant community is, do we provide feedback or not? And it's really hard. It's a lot of work. Some organizations do provide feedback. RSVP doesn't provide a lot of feedback right now to applicants, but it is something, like I said, organizations have debated. But that's why, look at another thing I might do, and I didn't say this, all of the winners, I think, are on the website. Is that right, Mary? Yeah, and yeah, Fanula is aggressively nodding. Look at the list of people who've won. If you've worked in Victorian periodicals, you probably know someone there. You certainly know me now from this. Ask those people for help. Ask those people for some insight on, how to make your application better. They've all done it. They've all made a winning application before. So, that's what I would do. It's tough. It's tough when you don't have sort of formal feedback to know where you fell short. But I always think that the time, that year that you put aside your proposal, when you come back to it, you're going to find all sorts of things there when you come back. So.
Excellent. And then Matthew has just thrown a question in the chat, which I'm going to read out. He's also enjoyed the Russell's rule of 3. So that's definitely a winning point. Russ, you'll have to use that in the future.
Oh, I've used that for a long time.
Yeah, fabulous. So Matthew's question was, how fine are the margins in competitions like the Curran, assuming that most applications will essentially complete and tick the relevant boxes? What makes one stand out over another? Great question. So
the margins, I think, are pretty fine. I would venture, I'm looking at the list of people who are on, and I don't see if Patrick would be a great one to talk here, since he has been so involved in the Curran Fellowship. We have more applications worthy of funding than we can fund. And that's the case for most humanities organizations, I would say. So what takes an application from being competitive to being funded? It's going to, I think in Curran, it's going to come down to how you talk about what we're learning about the periodical press, and that contribution. So it's one of those importance bullet points that I mentioned, and how pointed you can make that argument about why what you're looking at is going to help us understand the periodical press in a different way. Now, you might not know that. Now because you're just going into the archive. But if you should have a sense, you're doing the project for a reason, and sort of articulating that reason, because there's something that you're curious about and you want to learn. Articulating that is just going to be is key. There are a lot of people who assume that what they're doing is important, or they assume that they are important, and therefore should be funded. And for Curran, it's all about the project. It's not about, we want to make sure the person is, can bring it to a successful completion, of course, and they're the right person to do it. But it's really about that project. And so really thinking hard and critically about your own project and why it's important to do, and why you're curious about it. And those kinds of questions that you're going to take into the archive or to the library with you. I think that's what makes how well people talk about the importance, is what separates the competitive from the funded. And if there's someone else who's sat on one of these committees, please, by all means, pipe up here and let us and say something.
Yeah, Russ, I have sat on the committee a few times as well, and I agree with you that it is, the first point is the project. And when I was nodding earlier on there, rather than nodding aggressively, I was hopefully nodding encouragingly, especially if there are graduate students or first-time applicants in the room in particular, because the Curran is the place where the project leads. And you will see from previous award winners that it's a real mix of people at different stages of their career, and quite a high percentage of graduate student and early career students are funded in the Curran. The Peterson Award, which is another RSVP award, is kind of for more people in the later stages of their mid to later stages of their career, but the Curran is for everybody, and that it is the quality of the project that leads. And just like you're saying in the response to Matthew, the margins are fine, and not everybody you want to fund can be funded because the pot is limited. But I suppose the thing that makes a difference, to reiterate what you said so brilliantly in your presentation, it's how the parts of the application fit together. You might tick a range of boxes, but in ticking them all, have you brought them together? I think that was that you're telling a coherent narrative about who you are, why you need to do this, and why it's so significant and what it's going to change. They're the four parts of the thing that you're bringing together so coherently. So that I think is really, really important. And I just would encourage everybody, like Russ has been saying, to definitely get the application in as a first place to start. RSVP doesn't give line-by-line feedback to applicants because it's a voluntary organisation for the most part, and we don't have a huge administrative wing that is able to support giving line-by-line feedback. But if you want feedback on your application, you will be able to get some type of feedback by writing through our communications coordinator, who will pass it on to the president at the time, and they will be able to give you some feedback. And I also agree with Russ's point. Reach out to anybody that you know or anybody that you don't know whose name you see to ask for some tips and advice on this.
Yeah, this is an incredibly generous group. I've always found when I'm doing my own work, not necessarily applying for a grant for here, but whenever I'm doing my own work, reaching out to another member who I know might be interested in what I'm doing. And I've always had a great reception. So junior scholars, please do that. People who are in graduate school, please do that. Another thing is, I think especially junior people and people in graduate school, a lot of times talk themselves out of applying. They say, well, how can I possibly compete with someone who already has a book out, or I see their name every other month in the Victorian Periodicals Review. How can I compete with those people? you bring a lot of strengths to the table that you might not appreciate. So, if you're working on your dissertation, chances are you probably know the state of the field almost better than anyone. If you are, if you're working on a dissertation and you've had a project approved, it's probably because someone thinks somewhere, your dissertation advisor perhaps, that there is a gap in our knowledge there, because they're not going to, so you just have to find what that strength is. We all have it, and it's just a matter of figuring out what it is. A more senior person will have a different kind of strength, but it doesn't mean that it's any better of a strength.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a couple more really strong questions in the chat that I definitely want to get to. And the first one is from Atul. And this is great because I think a lot of the time with archival work, it's so exploratory and you're not exactly sure what you're going to get in the archives or what you're going to come across. So their question is, while writing for a grant, how can one account for the primary material that you may not know until you have access to a certain database or archive, especially in the case of 19th century periodicals?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's why it's really important, I think, to identify what are those questions you take into the archive to ask. In my work, for example, I work primarily on a group of periodical informed people in the early 19th century who were trying and failing to establish a periodical. And I don't know when I go in, what are their letters going to say? What knowledge am I going to glean from these? I don't know, are they writing to people to get them to try to submit articles to something that we know failed? So I don't know those particulars, but I know the questions I'm going to ask when I go into the library. And when I sit down in front of a big box of letters, I know those kinds of questions. And that's what I have to articulate. That's all I can articulate when, and those questions, I'm hoping are taking me somewhere. And obviously I have a hunch. So I think that's what you have to do. Obviously you can't say, well, I'm going to, do all of these great things and then write this article. But you can say, here are the questions I'm asking. I think I have a sense from what I've seen already that there is this thing going on. So here are my questions. And I'm hoping that then will result in an article or a dissertation chapter. It's a fine balance. And that's why I said, don't twist it and try to make your project something that it's not. A lot of times people think, oh, because I don't know the answer, I can't apply. And that's just so wrong. We want you to apply because you don't know the answer yet, but we want to know that you have a really interesting question that you're going to ask. I hope that helped, that tool. It's a tough balance, and it's going to be different for every project.
That's such a great point, Russ. We don't know the answer, and I think that kind of points to the importance of conducting that research, and it's buried in the archives and can really only come out once the research is conducted with the help of a Curran grant. Perfect. We have a question from Georgina. Hi, Georgina. She was at RSVP this year. She was wondering if the Society favors applications which specify more eco-friendly travel. She asked because she's applied to grants before, which, when provided with equally good applications, has stated that they opted for one over the other because they used more eco-friendly travel. And their advice has been to plan using a train or bus over a car versus a plane.
Okay, so I'm going to give, this is probably the politically incorrect answer, which is, as far as I'm aware of, no. We don't care. I mean, we do care, but there's nothing in our guidelines that says you're going to be evaluated based on that. I would hope everyone is thinking about that and applying to do the most eco-friendly way of travel. But the guidelines don't say anything about that, so we can't evaluate you on that. Is that correct? Fionnuala, do you have any thoughts? Yes, you do.
I have thoughts, Jordan. You raised the question, so now I will take it to the organisation and ask if this is something that we should apply to our grant criteria. Because it's not in the criteria for this year's awards, it will not be applied as a criterion to distinguish between applications. We can only distinguish between applications based on the criteria that have been set out, and that is not articulated anywhere. But it's a very important point you've raised, so we'll have to think about it and see if it should be. I don't know, Georgia, do you think it should? Well, you can type or turn on your mic.
Sorry, I'm in a bit of a noisy cafe here. Hi, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an important thing to consider. The difficulty I had with the grants and through my uni in the past is they do it to an extent that can make it very, very hard to plan. So for instance, I'm going to a conference next year in Germany, and my application, if I want to have a chance, I have to plan that via train or bus, which is nigh on impossible. I mean, it's hard enough to get there by a plane to the conference I'll be going to. So yeah, I think it is important. And I admire places that encourage it, but I just wonder if it was a prerequisite, because it is for some of the grants that I've applied to.
No, if it was a prerequisite, it would be specified in the criteria for the award. But because you've raised it and it's a really important one that's not articulated anywhere, that is something that in my current role I will take to the board of directors and ask them to consider this. Like Russ says, we would hope that everybody, this is a personal kind of commitment that everybody is making individually about their relationship to travel. But at the moment, the grants don't intervene in that kind of commitment. But perhaps it is something that, as you've raised it, is definitely something that we will consider, but it is not part of the criteria for this year, for instance. And if it becomes part of the criteria, that will be articulated.
One other thing is, we're an international group. And so we are seeing applications from East Asia. We see applications from Australia and India, as well as the UK and Canada and the US. It's really hard to impose, I would think, a sort of a strict way of travel, given this very international group that we have. But, obviously, we want to encourage everyone who applies to make the best decisions for our planet as will allow.
And
I think Tarini I don't know if it's more on this or if it's a different question, but I wanted to.
I do have a different question, but I wanted to add to that point about eco-friendly travel thing. Some of my archives are in India, and there's no way I can get there by by a bus or a train. So I guess it's part of where you need to go, really. But my question was for your incredibly helpful presentation was, firstly, you mentioned something about a good example, showing a good example through your application, I think, in the payout section, if I'm remembering correctly. And I just wanted to ask you if you could say more about what kind of examples, although I know it's really hard to give one, but what did you mean by that? And
I'm a big fan of examples when you're using, when you are working on really specialized topics. Think about the people who evaluate your project. They're trying very hard to understand how you are understanding your topic. And a lot of times in example, they'll say, if you want to say, I'm interested in doing feminist readings of X, Y, and Z. Well, a lot of times as panelists, we say, well, what does that actually look like? just adding a little bit, that gives us an example of how you're going to do that reading, that might be helpful to us. It's probably less important with Curran. Examples are probably less important simply because you're applying to do a different kind of thing. You're not doing as much interpretive work. It's more to get into the archives, to do that sort of thing. So it's probably less of at a premium in Curran, but it's still like an important, just remember that it's there in your quiver to pull out when you need it. I'm going to lower my table here as we have the next question, probably.
Yeah, and just another simple, really basic question, but I just probably thought of it. So you mentioned something about not being too ambitious, but also not undermining what you can do. And so let's say my application involves visiting maybe 2 archives that are in different locations. So would that be too ambitious? But also I need to get to those.
What are you doing there? I mean, I don't want to talk. I don't want to use this time to talk about your particular application.
Oh no, sorry. I just meant in general.
You just have to. You can be too ambitious and go to one place. You can be under ambitious and go to 5 places. That's why we ask for details, and that means if we're asking for details, that means we're asking you to find out, how much material is there? What are you going to look at? Are you looking at 2 issues of a magazine? Are you looking at 10 issues of a magazine or 20? That's how the ambitiousness is really, that's how we determine if something is if you're being overly ambitious. If you think, well, in a week, I'm going to look at, look through these 100 boxes of materials, that's probably too ambitious. Yeah. But if you have 1 letter to read, and you want a week in London to read 1 letter, you probably need to think about what else you could add.
Thank you.
Fabulous questions. Thank you so much. We have Antonia has a question, and I'm going to invite her to take the mic because she's turned her video on. And then we have another question from Kari after that.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the wonderful presentation and the tips. I'm speaking as someone who's working in Croatia, and travel to archives can be very expensive, and we've had some questions about travel. I was wondering if subscriptions to existing digitized databases of newspapers, which are beyond the paywall, might be eligible for funding. Thanks very much.
Yeah. So your question is, if you wanted to, instead of you were going to travel to the archive, is to use travel to some place where you could have access to subscriptions, or perhaps buy a subscription so that you could use. And I believe those are eligible. Are they? Yes, they are eligible.
Absolutely.
Can I add a qualification on that? They're eligible so long as you justify it. You can say, I need access to this database, so give me the money for it. But if you can articulate why you have no other choice but to use it in this way. So it's part of your rationale and part of the articulation of what is your second thing? Not the project. We know why you want it for the project, but why the conditions in which you're working demand this is the only way to do it.
And the flip side is true too. So if I was going to apply for a Curran to use the quarterly review, and I wanted to go from DC, where I live now, to London to do that, I would hope that the committee would scratch its head and wonder why, because the quarterly is pretty openly available. I can just go down the street to the Library of Congress and have the whole run there. So the flip side is true too. If you're going if you're applying to make a big trip and your material is readily available, that's something you need to justify. So the flip side is true.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then we have a really great question from Kari, who asked, to what extent do the budgetary considerations factor into the final decision making? Just because the society can fund up to 6,000, does that mean that your proposed project should cost up to that amount or come close to it?
Usually we come up with what we want to fund and then try to figure out how to do it with the budget that's available. And Fionnuala, if this differs from what your experience.
No, it's the same. Yeah.
It's, so, and it's always a balancing act. So we know that someone who's in India who needs to use materials in London, that will be a more expensive award than someone who is traveling from Ipswich to London. And so they will have different transportation costs. So we do think about that. The thing that we're also very conscious about, though, is, and people complain about this all the time, that they say, well, and not with Curran, but in my other life, say, well, you've given me money, but it's not enough money to do the work. And we want to be very, very careful. We're very careful that we don't say, well, congratulations, we're giving you this amount of money, and then it's not enough money, to get to the archives or to stay there. And we don't want the award to be a hardship. And so our cutting is usually very sparing. But Fionnuala, that's my recollection.
Yeah, no, that is true in terms of the cutting, but also just in another aspect of what Kari might be asking, just because you can apply for 6,000 awards or $6,000 doesn't mean you will be more competitive if you apply for the 6,000. If your project can be articulated and described and its significance explained and the budget justified, and it comes out at $3,500 and 10 other people are looking for $6,000, it doesn't mean that the people looking for $6,000 are going to automatically be ranked higher than you or more competitive than you. It's driven by the project. So if all you need to bring your brilliant idea to some kind of fruition is $3,500, ask for that and it will be as competitive as the person asking for 6,000. In fact, it's a pattern in Curran that people don't ask for the maximum amount. And every year when you look at it, whoever's chairing the committee writes back and tells us the number out of applicants who asked for the maximum amount. And it is more common not to ask for the maximum amount. And that means obviously that, for instance, last year, the Curran committee was able to grant 8 awards because not everybody asked. Everybody who asked for the full amount. Not everybody asked for the full amount, and there were a number of people who asked for lower amounts, and we were able to spread the money more widely. So it doesn't make it less competitive, Kari, if that's another aspect.
Another thing that's worth mentioning here is just a kudos to the board who increased the amount from 5,000, which is where it was last year, to 6,000, which you can do a lot with that additional $1,000. And so I'm really happy that the board did that because there will be some people who need that.
Excellent.
And the scales of projects differ greatly as well. So sometimes the scale of the project demands the 6,000. Yeah.
Fantastic. We've run a little bit over, but I think we needed to because we had such strong questions that needed to be addressed. Tremendous thank you to Russ for a wonderful presentation that really detailed explanation of what the current application is and best steps for success. I've certainly pulled out some wonderful tips that I'll be applying to my grant applications in the future. And I hope everyone that joined our session today submits a strong Curran application for this award cycle. You still have a month to go, so you better get writing and you better start looking for your referees. So once again, thank you, Russ, so much for such a great presentation. Thank you so much to Fionnuala for helping organize this really important session. And also thank you to all of the members of the Digital Event Committee for helping put this session together and the future sessions that we have coming up. I've put a reminder in the chat about the October 27th session that we have on the Curran Index, which will be very exciting indeed. And thank you all for joining this session today. It was really great.
Have we stopped recording?